pleasure to bring to you Mr. Robert Thompson and his paper, How Sparta Had It in the Second Half.
The Peloponnesian War was fought between 431 BC and 404 BC, with the Spartans and the Athenians taking up arms against each other. This war would lay the foundations for what the ancient world would become, and with whom the power stayed. Two of the most influential countries in the ancient world would battle one another upon land and sea with the most advanced technology of the time. And although Sparta and Athens both had equal capabilities of victory in the beginning, the war would be decided in Sparta's favor late in the war, after a failed campaign in Sicily. After this campaign, Athens would no longer have the opportunity to win the Peloponnesian War. This was due to a multitude of errors made on the part of the Athenians, which revolve around manpower and supply issues. In the years leading up to the Sicilian expedition, Athens had endured quite well. With the plague and the loss of Pericles, Athens had still been able to bring the Spartans to a truce, even if it had been just for a little while. The majority of Athens' forces were still intact and the city itself was still safe. And so with little threat from Sparta, Athens began to turn its gaze westward to the island of Sicily and the city of Syracuse. Sicily at the time was reportedly very wealthy, and there were reports to back up this claim. In Book 6, Section 8 of the Landmark Thucydides, Thucydides states, quote, "Early in the spring of the following summer, the Athenian envoys arrived from Sicily bringing the 60 talents of uncoined silver. This was enough silver to pay the entire crew of 60 ships for a month. Upon receiving such valuable cargo from Sicily, Athens immediately betrayed Sicily by planning a campaign which the purpose of was looting Sicily for all her wealth. Now, although many Athenian spies and visitors claimed there was an abundance of riches in Sicily, there was not at all the amount of wealth believed to be there. The 60 talents of silver given to Athens by Sicily was in fact quite hard to gather for the Sicilians, and probably left many Sicilians broke. Athens at the time did not know this, as the reports given to them by their informants were either exaggerated, or the wealth reported to them was completely false. To believe these reports without further inquiry was the first and possibly most devastating error made by Athens, as the entire purpose of the expedition to Sicily was to capture valuables and supplies. If the Athenians had more accurate reports on the actuality of Sicilian wealth, the plans for the expedition would have been reworked or entirely scrapped altogether. The false or exaggerated reports on Sicilian wealth would lead to the death of thousands of Athenians and possibly be the leading cause of Athenian defeat. With very little information or understanding of the Sicilian wealth, Athens immediately begins preparations for an invasion. When preparations were being taken into consideration, Nicias, the commander at the time, argued that 100 triremes, 100 transports, and 5,000 hoplites or infantry, and other forces along with other needed supplies would be a large enough force to conquer Sicily. Although the projected force, in theory, could be assembled, the reality was that such a force could not be assembled in the amount of time given before departure. The order to launch the expedition was given in the summer of 415 BC, but the Athenian force left Athens in the same summer. So at most, Athenian commanders were given 6 to 8 weeks to prepare for the second largest force ever gathered by a single city during the Peloponnesian War. This was not nearly enough time to prepare for such an endeavor, and as a result, only 60 warships and 40 transports were assembled, as Thucydides claims, quote, providing empty ships, 60 warships and 40 transports, and manning these with the best crews obtainable. Close quote. Compared to the initial figure of needed ships and men given by Nicias, the actual force being sent was significantly smaller and less prepared. Athens did later receive ships from her allies, with the final total ships being about 134, but this would not be enough. It should be noted that Nicias deemed about 200 total ships inadequate force, instead of the 134 actually given, as a force able to seize Sicily. Another overlooked factor was the amount of time able to subdue Sicily. If the Athenian force were to leave in midsummer of 415 BC, they would have only about a month and a half at most to defeat and subdue Sicily, as the fall and winter were not typically fighting seasons. The Athenian force could fight through the winter if necessary, but this would put even more strain on the supply lines from Athens, even if supplies could be gathered from Sicily. Although the Athenian fleet was prepared for a long journey, there was no mention of how long they were prepared to campaign for. Although it would be safe to assume the Athenians had planned for a short campaign, considering Alcibiades' speeches on how the Sicilians were viewed at the time, At such a distance from their homeland and supplies, the Athenian likelihood of success would drop every day they spent in Sicily as their army consumed supplies. In the years leading up to 415, the majority of the Athenian military action had been well thought out and planned, as he had fought Sparta and her allies. However, the entire campaign to Sicily is rushed to action without proper preparation to fight the long drawn-out conflict that Sicily would become. And part of the reason Athens did not take long to prepare was the belief that Sicily would not be a difficult enemy to fight. Athens is relying solely on the Sicilians being a pushover than actually preparing to fight a legitimate military force. And this is a mentality which is reinforced from the beginning in Alcibiades' speeches. In initial arguments, Alcibiades says, quote, "The cities in Sicily are peopled by motley rabbles and easily change their institutions and adopt new ones in their stead," close quote. Alcibiades is arguing that no matter what, Athens will win because Sicilians are a more basic people group and cannot stand up to the Athenian force. This was, in fact, not the case, as Athens would find out, and the lack of preparation would greatly harm the Athenian fighting capabilities, as the conflict would drag on. Had Athens only waited and prepared more supplies for their forces and gathered a larger force, they most certainly would have beaten the Sicilians in due time. But this rush to attack Sicily would leave little time to prepare, and it's this lack of preparation which would doom Athens. The expedition would start off successfully, with Athens taking several cities early on and pushing the Syracusans and Sicilian forces back to the city of Syracuse. But by the winter of 415, Syracuse and much of Sicily was still standing, and the Athenians hadn't been able to capture few, if any, supplies, while the supplies they had brought with them were still being consumed. In order to keep their forces capable of fighting, Athenian commanders had to pull their forces back and wait for more supplies to arrive. As a direct result of their poor preparation in the summer, before the Athenian army would have to wait weeks at a time for food, weapons, and armor, giving their enemies time to regroup and prepare defenses for the oncoming attack. Had Athens brought enough supplies, he would have been able to keep attacking the Syracusan forces, not giving them time to prepare a defense of Syracuse or regroup. Athens could have been able to overrun Syracuse and its defenses, capturing the largest city in all of Sicily, and completing the intended goal of their campaign. Instead, the Athenian army would have to rely on an overextended supply line, which would take weeks or even months to arrive from Athens. This gives the Athenian offensive a stop-start motion, where the Athenians would attack for a month or two, then have to stop and wait for more supplies to reach them. The Athenians would try to time this resupply time for the winter months, when fighting wasn't as common, but the winter months were also the most dangerous time to be sailing, as storms were frequent. And the poor weather would force Athenian supply ships to delay, forcing the Athenian army to wait even longer for supplies. All the while, the Syracusan and Spartan forces would set up defensive positions and reinforce themselves due to the fact that they did not have to wait for ships to arrive from the other side of the Mediterranean. Then, the Spartan Syracusans would wait on their walls in their fortifications for the Athenians to attack, often having the defenders' advantage. The lack of initial preparation by Athens would cost them the campaign, once because he had to stop and wait for supplies. If Athens had brought enough proper supplies to fight a much longer campaign, they would have defeated the Syracusans, captured supplies and valuables, and returned to Athens, the Athenian homeland, before the Spartans could send a force to aid Sicily, or Syracuse. While the Athenian expeditionary force waited for supplies, Sparta began preparations to send reinforcements to Syracuse. The time it was taking Athens to resupply their force in Sicily gave the opportunity to send soldiers in defense of Syracuse by Sparta. Under the commander of General Gylippus, the Spartan force of about 2,100 men total met the Athenian forces in Sicily. As Thucydides says, quote, "It was still possible for an army arriving by Epiolae to effect an entrance," close quote. Although the Spartans' end goal was the defense of Syracuse, General Gylippus would halt or would land at Himera, which would put them behind the Athenian force attacking Syracuse. This would open up a second front for the Athenian army, forcing them to fight on two sides and divide their forces. At the same time, a fleet from Corinth moved past the Athenian fleet, meeting the Syracusan forces and bolstering their navy. In the time it took to resupply the Athenian force, both Sparta and Corinth were able to reinforce the Syracusan defenses and cut off further Athenian resupply convoys from reaching the Athenian forces. At the same time, Spartan forces attacked the Athenian homeland, which forced the Athenians to withhold even more supplies from the expeditionary force so that the homeland defenses could be properly maintained. Meanwhile, the Athenian forces in Sicily are desperate for supplies to the point where they are no longer able to continue attacking the Syracusans. Nicias, the commander of the Athenian forces in Sicily at the time, wrote a report to the Athenian government detailing the current situation the Athenian expeditionary force found itself in. In his letter to Athens, Nicias informs the public of the dire situations he finds his forces in. Much emphasis put on the decline of his navy and the condition of the ships. Many Athenian vessels had begun to decay due to the fact that they could not make land for repairs because of Syracusan cavalry, which held control of the coast. And Nicias also mentions how hard it was to bring in supplies now, going back to the fact that the Athenian supply lines were overstretched and in danger of Corinthian ships. Nicias says, quote, "For it is already difficult to carry in supplies past Syracuse," close quote. The Athenian forces in Sicily at this point were outnumbered, short in supplies, men, ships, and it was becoming more and more difficult for Athens to resupply Nicias' force. With few options left, Nicias asked for the Athenian expeditionary force to either be recalled or reinforced as soon as possible before Gylippus can gather more forces over the winter. Quote, you must promptly decide either to recall us or send us out another fleet, and army as numerous again," close quote. Nicias, in his letter to Athens, the Athenian force was more or less stranded and surrounded on an island far away from supplies and reinforcements, with their situation becoming worse daily. Athens did attempt to resupply the Athenian expeditionary force, but by this time it was too little too late. Athens had multiple opportunities before the arrival of Spartan and Corinthian forces to resupply Nicias, but had failed to do so every time, instead keeping supplies and men back for the defense of the Athenian home territory. Athens should have sent more supplies to Sicily in an attempt to save the forces there in hopes that those same forces would return to defend Athens later. By this point in the war, Athens would need every soldier could get so that they could defend themselves from the Spartan onslaught which was to come. Instead, the soldiers in Sicily are left to die because of supply line failures and Athenian generals holding back supplies for the few soldiers defending the city of Athens. Had the soldiers in Sicily managed to even retreat home, there would have been a possibility for an Athenian victory later on. Rather, the Athenian hopes of a victory are lost once they can no longer reinforce Sicily. While the Athenians prepared reinforcements, Sparta and Corinth saw their time to strike. Corinth prepared a fleet to challenge the Athenian ships near the Peloponnesus, while the Spartans invaded Attica and the Athenian homeland. Both of these offensives were successful, leaving much Athenian farmland destroyed and Corinthian forces reaching Sicily. In Sicily, Gylippus launched a land and sea attack, which took the forts at Plemmyrium, which destroyed some of the much-needed Athenian supplies and gave the Syracusans control of both sides of the harbor where the Athenian navy is docked. Now, the only way for the Athenian supplies to reach its forces is to sail into the harbor, putting them in danger of Syracusan forts. As mentioned earlier, the Athenian navy was overwhelmed by the task given to them while they were in such poor condition. Not only did they have to ferry supplies, but also defend the port of Piraeus and the Sicilian harbor. The Athenian navy was far too extended to be able to complete its tasks. And to only make the situation worse, in 413 BC, the Spartans and Syracusans began a combined assault on the Athenian walls that had been around their camp in Sicily, while the Syracusan naval forces attacked the remains of the Athenian navy docked in the harbor. This attack was ultimately successful, and the Athenian navy fled deeper into the harbor near Syracuse as the Syracusan navy pursued them. These counterattacks from Syracuse and Sparta sealed the fate of the Athenian forces. Once the Athenian navy starts to get trapped in the Great Harbor by the Syracusans, the chances of receiving any supplies, if at all, are gone. Athens, the city required 134 ships to be sent to Sicily to ferry and protect further supplies, as this was the majority of their entire navy. But over the course of the sealing campaign, over half of these ships would be sunk or too damaged to fight. And once the Syracusans begin to close in, the Athenian navy can no longer put up a fight, can no longer fight its way out without assistance from more capable ships. Meaning that without new ships or refurbishing the current fleet, the Athenian navy is effectively useless to fight the enemy or defend its supply ships. And this is something which Nicias thought would happen when he wrote his letter to the Athenian leaders. And it was the continuous fighting of the Athenian navy. The continuous fighting the Athenian navy was enduring had made them under strength and the least capable at the time they were needed the most. Instead of recalling the Athenian expeditionary force when the opportunity was available, the Athenian government had sent a half-hearted attempt at a resupply. The failure of the Athenian government to see the forces in Sicily could not win, along with the decay and overextension of the Athenian navy, would trap the Athenian expeditionary force on Sicily. At this time, Nicias had few options left, and his supplies were at an all-time low, and his navy was stuck in a harbor. Unable to attack and unable to make an escape, Nicias could only sit in his encampment and wait for an Athenian relief force, which had been sent some weeks before. The hope was that these new forces would be able to quickly attack the Spartan camp and overcome the forces there, then move south to aid Nicias in taking the city of Syracuse. Athens had sent a smaller fleet with these new forces with the goal of overcoming the Syracusan one. At the same time, the Syracusans had slowly pushed Nicias' defensive lines further and further back from the walls of Syracuse, and the Syracusan fleet had managed to destroy all the Athenian supply vessels in Italy, which had been waiting to resupply Nicias. Many of the Athenian coastal forts were taken in these attacks, which put Nicias' fleet directly in threat. And finally, in the summer of 413 BC, the second major Athenian expedition reached Sicily and attacked the Spartan fortifications on the northeastern side of the island. This second force, the second Athenian force, consisted of 73 ships and about 6,000 combined land forces, 5,000 of which were hoplites or infantry. Almost immediately, though, the second Athenian force was nearly destroyed with the majority of their weapons and supplies being captured by the Spartans, leaving Nicias' force alone on the island. Although the Athenians believed that this second force would change the outcome of the expedition, it's unlikely that this force would have had a lasting effect. By this point, another large Spartan force was preparing to set sail for Sicily, and the Syracusan navy was at its strongest point in the war at this time. Given a few weeks or months, Spartan reinforcements, along with the Corinthian fleet, would have been able to arrive and to continue the conflict. Even if the second Athenian force had succeeded in taking Spartan camp, they still would have been on the other side of Syracuse from Nicias, with Spartan and Syracusan forces between them. They would have been forced to march several miles through Spartan Syracusan defensive positions to reach Nicias, as the Syracusan fleet and forts would have prevented them from entering the harbor where Nicias' navy was waiting. It is unlikely that the second Athenian force would have enabled Nicias' force to capture the city of Syracuse. And the commander of the second force realized this and requested that his fleet and remains of his forces be called back to defend Athens after their defeats, as they were more valuable there. Prior to the second force landing on the northeast, Thucydides recalls the thoughts of the Athenian commander saying, quote, "This he took to be the shortest way of ending the war, as he would either succeed and take Syracuse or lead back the armament instead of frittering away the lives of the Athenians." Close quote. If the second force could not take Syracuse, then they would not stay any longer as Nicias had done, for fear of losing the second force. Although this was a sound plan, the goal of the second force should have been opening an escape route for Nicias, so the majority of Athenian soldiers could return for the defense of Athens. Unfortunately, neither of these would happen due to the destruction of the second force, and the real failures of this second force had nothing to do with supply issues or their own capabilities. Rather, it was a mix of their timing, the preparation of the Spartans, and just plain bad luck. By the time they arrived, the Spartans had well-defended positions from the many months of their encampment, which the second force could not overcome. And in an attempt to surprise the Spartans, the second force attacked by night and nearly overwhelmed the Spartans. But in the darkness, they couldn't tell who was friend or foe, and as a result, the second Athenian force ended up killing each other, just as the Spartans were near defeat. Had the second force not fought themselves, the Spartan force in their camp would have been defeated, and the possibility of taking Syracuse or saving Nicias would have been higher. Now that the second force was all but destroyed, Nicias hopes of escape solely rely on the efforts of his own force. However, an escape would have been nearly impossible to pull off, considering the Syracusan navy had Nicias' navy sealed off in the harbor. Weighing his options, Nicias decided to launch an all-or-nothing naval attack to escape the harbor. He pulled soldiers off the front lines so that every single ship could be crewed and began his attack. Thucydides recalls that both sides showed great ferocity in battle, and that the ships were so close together that no force could properly maneuver. This crowding of ships greatly benefited the Syracusans, as Athenian naval doctrine revolved around high-speed maneuvers and evasion. The Syracusans had known this for a while and even tried earlier in the conflict to keep the Athenian force from maneuvering within the harbor, but now they're making full use of it. As a result, the Athenian navy suffered a massive defeat and withdrew back into the harbor. This defeat was more of one of morale than, this defeat was more of a morale one, though as the Athenian navy was still possessed more ships than Syracuse did. However, Athenian crews refused to board their ships when asked to attack again for fear of their lives. Quote, but when they wished to man the vessels, the sailors refused to go on board, being so utterly overcome by their defeat, close quote. Nicias' fleet would never sail out against the enemy again. Although Nicias had been defeated at sea, the escape attempt was the best option he could have made. The real fault of the attack was the quality of ships the Athenians had, along with the decisions to use soldiers to crew these ships. As mentioned in his letter, Nicias states that the ships were rotting and damaged, and it was these same rotting ships which would be fighting the Syracusan navy. Nicias probably would have been able to escape the harbor had his ships been in better fighting condition and had they the space to maneuver. The second fault was using soldiers to crew these ships, as these soldiers were not trained to be sailors, and they most likely had no experience sailing or with naval warfare. These soldiers, although placed in a non-leadership role in these ships, would have not known how to maneuver or crew these vessels, much less use them effectively in combat. Nicias needed proper sailors if he wanted to win the naval battle against Syracuse, not foot soldiers. With no morale along the ranks, and with very few supplies left, the Athenian force planned to retreat by land. The problem with this retreat was the fact that every road leading to Italy, where the Athenian allies were, was under the control of the Spartans or Syracusans. Unable to retreat north, west, or east, Nicias prepared to move south. Nicias would rush to the Athenian River as fast as possible due to the fact that his army only had what supplies he could carry with them, which included water. Nicias hoped that at the Athenian River, his forces could gather supplies, then evade the Spartans long enough to avoid capture. But the Athenian force could no longer fight the Spartans and Syracusans, as they had become an unorganized rabble in their retreat. This gave the Spartans the opportunity to continuously attack the Athenians as they fled. The slow pace of the Athenian army made it very easy for the Spartans and the Syracusans to cut them off at every chance, and prevented the Athenians from gathering supplies. After some days of marching, the commander Decisive and the 6,000 Athenians were captured, as they could no longer fight. Shortly after this, Nicias' force was slaughtered at the Athenian River, as his dehydrated men desperately tried to drink from the river. After this, Nicias and the remains of his force surrendered, which, quote, could not have been less than 7,000, as Thucydides states. The defeat of Nicias' forces saw the end of Athens' chances at winning the Peloponnesian War and the Athenian dominance in the Mediterranean. In their final retreat from the defenses in Sicily, Athens would lose no less than 40,000 men and 60 ships. And from this defeat, Spartans would gain Syracuse as an ally, along with dominance of the seas. And although the war would continue for 9 more years, Athens would always be fighting on their back foot against greater numbers, never being able to deliver a blow which could swing the war back in their favor. And this would be as a direct result from the defeat in Sicily. The failed Sicilian campaign did indeed doom Athens for a whole multitude of reasons, such as the lack of information, the lack of preparation, the consistent failures to resupply the Athenian expeditionary force, and the failures to resupply the Athenian expeditionary force. There were multiple times where an Athenian victory could have been achieved, and had more of these factors been in their favor, or at least planned for such, as resupplying their force more regularly, or more thorough preparations made. But from the beginning, Athens rushed into sending a force to Sicily without the needed preparation, under the belief that Syracuse would fall after a few months of fighting, and as a result, it would cause the largest defeat in Athenian history at the time and lead to the defeat of Athens.
Thank you very much, Mr. Thompson. I'll have to admit that's the first time I have gotten a paper that is extensively on Thucydides. So, thank you very much. Now, part of the reason for that is Thucydides has a great amount of detail that most students find a little overwhelming, and we do tend to focus on very broad philosophic themes, open-ended questions, and that sort of thing. You've chosen to look at a lot of detail regarding the Athenian expedition. My first question for you is you draw your work primarily, or actually exclusively, from Thucydides, and you seem to have ignored Plutarch. And I don't know, just as a bit of a hint to you, Plutarch is basically the ancient cliff notes to Thucydides. And so, why didn't you use Plutarch? Make it easy on yourself.
I didn't use Plutarch just because all the same information was in Thucydides, and I was looking for more details, such as the number of ships which were actually sent and the number of men. Whereas, again, Plutarch was essentially the cliff notes that gave more of a broad understanding. And I felt that I should focus on the specific details leading into it, instead of just saying, Athens went to Sicily, Athens was defeated, this caused the defeat of Athens in the long run. I wanted to focus more on as to why they were defeated rather than they were.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you very much. Now, in looking at your presentation of the information, the question I find myself asking is, throughout this campaign, throughout the Sicilian campaign, what do you think, even though there's probably a number of mistakes that are made, all of which could have helped their situation if they hadn't made them, what do you think is really kind of the decisive mistake that was made in the Athenian expedition, or what would you say was the moment they could have changed the tide if they'd acted differently?
Well, of course, I mentioned the second Athenian force landing in the north and almost overwhelming the Spartans. I think had that force succeeded and been able to rout the Spartans, sort of freeing up Nicias as a larger force, the two forces could have worked together to take Syracuse, although it's a bit of a long shot considering the extensive defenses that had been put up by the Syracusans. I think that was, the defeat of that second force really kind of sealed the deal. With that second force being, again, the remaining majority of the Athenian land forces that were showing up to essentially take Syracuse. So I think had that force succeeded in overwhelming the Spartans, there was a much better chance of them succeeding. Although, it was sort of, after you see the first year of fighting in Sicily, it starts to kind of break apart.
Thucydides does describe the attack on the fort at Plemmyrium and the strategic advantage that came to the Syracusans when they were able to seal off the entrance to that harbor and thus keep the Athenians from getting any reinforcements. I don't remember a lot of detail that Thucydides gives about that battle, but I've always wondered why the Athenians were willing to give up that fort apparently so easily when it was so strategic. And do you have any thoughts on why the Athenians did not continue to struggle to retake Plemmyrium?
Well, it was more the lack of Athens' ability to. I wish I had a map here to show you, but essentially you have Syracuse right here on this peninsula, and then the Great Harbor kind of loops around, and the forts being on the other side, right? And the Athenians were fighting, so if this is Syracuse, the Athenians were fighting up here all the way to down here. So their forces were already stretched pretty thin, trying to fight off the Spartans and Syracusans. And at the time, the forts seemed to be safe, and the forts were more of a way to essentially rebuild Athenian ships than they were to actually defend things at the time. And so the Athenians were also really trusting of their navy, believing that their navy could prevent a Syracusan breakthrough to get to the forts. And it was actually a naval landing, which gave the forts a clearing over to the Syracusans. And so really, it's not that the Athenians didn't want to take back the forts. They in fact launched, I think, 2 attacks to try and retake them. but it's more that their forces were already overwhelmed by trying to fight on like multiple fronts. Their forces had already been exhausted because by this point they were almost over a year into fighting with, again, no real reinforcements coming in, so their soldiers were exhausted by this point. So it's more of they couldn't take them rather than they wanted to take them.
Mm-hmm. Well, the Athenians seem to have made a massive tactical miscalculation in the Sicilian campaign, and you kind of wonder at what point do they start to realize that. And as their experience began to show them that it was not a campaign they're going to be able to win easily, at what point do you think that the Athenians really should have realized that it was time to retreat? It was time to surrender or to leave and go back to Athens?
That's actually a pretty good question, because there's a lot of different like memoirs coming from some of the different commanders that were there mentioned in Thucydides, such as the commander of the second force. After his forces were defeated, he asked to go back to Athens. He was like, look, we can't take him here, let's just go back and defend. And it was actually Nicias who said, hey, no, we need to stay here and try and take Syracuse. And I think even before that, Nicias had some idea that this was already a losing campaign from the start, as he argued against the campaign from the beginning with Alcibiades. But I think Nicias, in the beginning, had full confidence in their victory. And it wasn't until after he wrote his letter to Athens that he started to catch on the idea that here in Sicily, we're not going to win. Mm-hmm. However, the Athenians didn't really realize this till after the battle had already been lost and the Athenians were killed. As is mentioned, I think in the beginning of Book 8, when sort of once they hear the news of the Athenian defeat in Syracuse, the Athenian populace just becomes sad and depressed. And that's something that's brought up by Thucydides at the time. And although the Athenians decide to keep going on with the war, even though they've suffered this major loss. So I don't think anyone really realized that they should have left until after they had been defeated.
Mm-hmm. Well, it does seem that the choice to make this campaign was ill-fated from the beginning. And do you have any insight into why these Athenians made that choice in the beginning? I mean, Thucydides does talk about the persuasive powers of Alcibiades, but the Athenians believed him, and there must have been a reason for their willingness to give him so much credence, or just kind of believing what they wanted to hear. But what would you attribute the Athenian mistake, or their being so easily misguided in making the choice to launch this campaign in the first place?
I was really hoping you'd ask this question.
Right.
Because this goes into pre-Sicilian Athenian thought, which after the initial conflicts with Sparta, the two sides had kind of ground down to a truce, and almost like a World War I style of like attrition, to the point where it was only after a bunch of generals on both sides had been killed that the two sides said, hey, we're not going to do anything here, let's come to a truce. And it's after this truce that even though it's not directly expressed, it's sort of hinted at, that the Athenian populace was losing confidence in the military, and they needed another way to kind of re-bolster themselves. And so they didn't really have confidence that they could beat the Spartans in another land war like they had done previously. And so as a result, the idea that they could go and capture supplies and valuables from Syracuse in order to essentially buy more mercenaries and build more ships in other places sort of gave us an idea that if we go take Sicily, we'll have a better chance at fighting the Spartans. Mm-hmm. And it's more of this, they make this, well, even though Alcibiades has his own reasons for it, there's more of this necessity to go to Sicily, as it's really the only best option they have to essentially maintain the upper hand against Sparta. Because if they hadn't gone to Sicily and they had just planned on waiting it out, they probably would have still lost in the end, as long as their supply ships could have been defeated by the Spartans.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like the way that you're describing it is that they've gotten into a desperate situation, and because they were in a desperate situation, they decided to employ a plan that's even more desperate.
Yeah, that's pretty much.
What is the psychology behind that? Why, in a very difficult situation, do you go after a plan that seems even extraordinarily difficult?
Well, again, at the time that they launched the Sicilian expedition, they were at a truce with Sparta. So at the time, they didn't believe that Sparta would intervene or that Sparta would ignite another conflict so soon after the first one. So the Athenian mindset was more of, now is our chance before anything else happens. Because at the time, there were border skirmishes between Athenian and Spartan forces, nothing of like major battle worthiness. But the Athenians did know that they had to take this time of truce, to essentially rebuild their forces before anything else was going to happen. And I would be confident in saying that Sparta was eventually going to attack again, just on the basis that it's the two biggest kids on the block, and eventually they're just going to get into it.
Mm-hmm. And how would you describe the rise of the Spartan maritime power? That had always been the Athenian trump card, was their maritime ability. But by the Sicilian campaign, it seems the Spartans are able to go head to head, at least with the help of the Corinthians and the Syracusans, with the Athenian naval power. And do you see anything in Thucydides kind of describing the origin of that increase in Spartan maritime power?
Well, I wouldn't say it's necessarily it's more of Corinth giving technology to the Syracusans, which I didn't mention it in this paper, but Thucydides does mention that Syracusan naval doctrine does change significantly from going towards a Athenian style of battle, which was you line up your ships and you board the other ship and try and take it, to essentially the Corinthian style, which was just ram the ships and try and sink them. Mm-hmm. And this really kind of catches the Athenians by surprise, as their entire naval doctrine revolves around being very fast and being able to evade enemy ships, so they could essentially pull up, jump on the enemy ship, take it, and then sail away before enemy ships could come and try and take the Athenian ship, which had just taken their friend, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's this change in doctrine on the Syracusans' part that sort of levels the playing field, on top of the fact that 134 Athenian ships were in that harbor. Even though 40 of them were transports, it is safe to assume that these transports were also used as combat vessels, especially in the end when Thucydides says that Nicias boarded every vessel he could, seaworthy or not. And so it's really the separation of the Athenian navy, where you have Athenian ships up defending the port of Piraeus next to Athens and the coastal areas of Athenian property, and the majority of the fleet being in Sicily, being surrounded by the Syracusans. Mm-hmm. And whereas the Corinthians, the Spartans, and the Syracusans all had their fleets in one place, essentially being able to overwhelm the Athenian force just by numbers and of course their change in tactics, as the fact that Athens needed a second fleet to be able to carry supplies in and out of Athens to feed their people, as Sparta had taken all the farmlands around Athens, and so the only way to get food in was through their navy. And so instead of sending their entire fleet at once to go kind of fight off the Spartans and Corinthians, they had to keep a second fleet of approximately the same size as the first, to sort of ship supplies back and forth from Athens and the other ports that they were gathering supplies from.
Mm-hmm. All right. More of a personal reflection, but as I said, this is a bit of a first after 29 years of teaching, to see a student wrap their mind around Thucydides so extensively. How did it feel to have your mind thoroughly enmeshed in the world of Thucydides for a few weeks?
Honestly, I really enjoyed it. I wish I could have written 3 different papers. The first one being on the pre-Sicilian campaign, and the Sicilian campaign, and the post-Sicilian campaign, just because they're all very interesting topics. I loved it. Thucydides goes into great detail on the statistics and numbers of the militaries at the time. For the most part, he kind of leaves out the Spartans because he didn't have that information. But the amount of detail which can be gathered from Thucydides and just the statistics on what they were working with at the time, I find very, very interesting.
All right. Other questions?
Yeah. Would you like to go first? Oh, okay. Welcome to GPT-5 alum status.
Yeah.
It's great, isn't it? Fantastic paper, once again. And that goes to everybody. Fantastic papers all around. But, okay. So, after I graduated GBT5 and then got on to an associate's in music, I'm now working on a literature and writing bachelor degree. And as part of that, I'm exposed to a lot of textual criticism, a lot of philosophy of history, and some of this is just because I really love living in a constant state of an exciting mental crisis, not existential.
Yeah.
But I just love thinking about this stuff all the time. And that includes like philosophy of science, epistemology. And so, speaking about epistemology, let's dive a little bit deeper. So my question is probably best framed in this way. One of the books that I'm reading for pleasure right now is Dr. Michael Iconia's The Resurrection of Jesus, a New Historiographical Approach. Within page 78, he has a helpful quote explaining one school of thought that I get a lot of exposure to. This is about postmodernism. Of this school of thought, he says, and he's not a postmodernist, he says, the postmodernist says this: there are no facts, only interpretations. There is also the denial of a concrete reference outside of a description. Instead, it is language itself that constitutes the past, charged by the horizon of the reader and creating meaning in the reader's image of the past. End quote. Now, there's a bunch of other fantastic postmodernists he quotes, which also explains postmodernism in more detail. But so my question to you is: you dive so deep into Thucydides, and how would you talk to a postmodernist? How would you talk to somebody who says, "Oh, it's Thucydides. Yeah, nice story. Did it happen?
Yeah.
Not really." How would you respond to that sort of a person?
Well, and that's sort of it would be difficult to answer that person, mainly because Thucydides is the leading source on the Peloponnesian War. He was the guy that really documented it. There was a Spartan guy that did document it as well, but he mainly just focuses on Sparta, and it's a very propaganda style set of writings, where it's essentially just saying, "Oh, Sparta's the greatest." And so really, you can't really answer that question because there's not a lot of other sources which back up Thucydides, other than like historical or archaeological evidence that supports this. There's not much other in terms of writings, other than like a few snippets here and there. It's really Thucydides that kind of sets up the majority of what we know about the Peloponnesian War. So really, a majority of this is just writing on, we're hoping that Thucydides is true and hoping that what he's saying is realistic. And then of course there's writings here and there from other people from different parts at the time that, throw in a little bit which corroborate Thucydides' story. Such as Spartan writers here and there mentioning the number of ships or the number of men or where they were or how they got there, right? But other than that, Thucydides is like the real main leading writer on this. And it's really up to Thucydides, these other little writings, and the archaeological evidence to kind of come together to form this picture. And the other reason, I could have used the Spartan guy, but the reason I didn't was, again, he's very just pro-Sparta, and that would have kind of ruined the whole look at how this battle went down, from saying, oh, the Athenians had a chance to, oh no, Sparta was going to win from the beginning. So again, it's kind of hard to answer like a postmodernist question like that, because we have very little writing on the subject. No problem. Yes.
Thank you for bringing up Thucydides. I never understood the jokes. If I remember, I read it a long time ago. Prior to the campaign, that when they were trying to advocate for it, Nicias, you mentioned, he voted against it. He didn't want to go, and Alcibiades did, and people didn't trust Alcibiades. So they appointed two commanders, Nicias and Alcibiades, correct?
Yes.
And that caused problems because each had a different idea of how to prosecute the campaign. And then Alcibiades got recalled and he escaped. But what do you think? I know this is all just guessing, but do you think the war would have ended differently if Alcibiades, one of the reasons why people chose him or they were able to advocate for the campaign is because even though he's a reprehensible person, he was an outstanding general. Do you think that would have been different if he just would have been the general in charge and he would be able to prosecute it the way he wanted to?
No, I think the outcome would have still been the same, only based on the factors that were affecting the Athenians. I don't think it came down to a skill-based campaign. It was down to who had the more supplies, the more men, and who was getting more routine supplies. Because Nicias himself was a great commander, even though he had issues with Alcibiades, to the point where he burned apart, like he set a giant fire around his camp to keep Spartans away and stuff. And Nicias was also, I think, the longest serving general at the time in the Athenian army, who had served through the majority of this war. And so he had plenty of experience going into Sicily. And again, the only real reason why Nicias didn't want to go was because he was afraid of manpower issues. Was that the plague had killed the majority of the Athenian soldiers, and he was worried that they wouldn't be able to sustain that. So I don't think it comes down to a skill-based conflict. I think it really does come down to the manpower, the money, and the supplies going into it.
Okay. So how would you explain the Spartan commander? Because when he first got there, I believe he lost the first land battle and the first naval battle, but it was his ability to accept responsibility and to change that changed everything.
Yeah.
Correct. So it's like one commander, Alcibiades, has his way. I mean, the commander of the forces makes a big deal. Is a big ingredient in winning. So even with that in mind, you still think Alcibiades, even though he had some problems, but he also had some solutions to all the problems that he was never able to try because he was taken out so early. Even with all that, you would think he wouldn't be able to do it.
Well, again, it goes down to whether or not the Spartans intervene or not. Because had Alcibiades not fled to the Spartans probably wouldn't have intervened. And this is something that the Spartans talk about for a long time. They have multiple debates over whether or not they should go. And it's the pressure from the Corinthians and their allies which really in the end makes them go. And Alcibiades just telling them the plan of what the Athenians are doing. So had Alcibiades not gone to the Spartans, the Athenians probably would have won. But if you pull the Spartans out of the equation, you're looking at an entirely different conflict, which could be classified as not the Peloponnesian War, because it doesn't involve the Peloponnesian League. It just involves the Athenians and the Sicilians. And that's where it's sort of, could the Athenians have won with the Spartans not being there? Absolutely. But at that point, it's not the Peloponnesian War, it's a different conflict.
Okay, thank you.
For sure. Yes?
I am not familiar enough in military history to comprehend this as thoroughly as you did, so kudos for the paper. My question is, how well do you think this would work as a comedy?
As a comedy, I guess that depends on the scope of the comedy. I could see it being a comedy from the point of the messengers, like relaying messages. I could see that. I could definitely see it from the point of the politicians at home trying to understand what's going on, as there's a bunch of different conflicting reports at once. I don't see that as being a comedy from Nicias' perspective, as he's just being annihilated by the Spartans. I don't see that being the case, but I think there's certainly room for interpretation.
Nice job, Honor.
Thank you.
So my question is, you mentioned Athens kind of rushed in without being prepared because they thought they were going to be able to knock it out pretty quickly. That seems like a common thing that we see ancient all the way up to modern times. Look at Russia and Ukraine. Why do you think that keeps happening? Why do you think people rush into battle or enter into a war when they think, oh, this is only going to take us a couple months, and it ends up much longer?
Well, I can't necessarily answer for every war that's been fought like that, but from my experiences, it's usually a sort of the person going into their point of view sort of elevates themselves. And as Nicias says in his early debates, he views the Sicilians as motley rabbles. He believes them to be sort of barbaric peoples that really don't have an allegiance to anything and won't stay together when they get attacked. And same thing with, Hitler and the Germans. The idea was that the Slavic people were a lesser being than the Aryan race, and that they would just kind of fall apart after the Germans invaded. Same thing with World War I, where the British were like, we'll be home by Christmas. The Germans aren't going to hold up. And so it's really more of they're seeing themselves as being a better force just based on their own, whether it be trusting their military too much, whether it be seeing themselves as superior beings or more educated or more civilized people. I think that's probably the majority of it. And I think the other reason why Athens really rushed into this was This was also one of the first times that Athens launched a significant offensive. There had been other times in the past leading up to this, but this was sort of the first one where they were like, we're gonna go out, we're gonna go get them, we're gonna make sure we win. Whereas before, a lot of the conflict between Sparta and Athens had been the Athenian navy kind of rolling up, attacking a couple of forts, killing some guys, taking some supplies, and retreating again. And for the most part, the Athenians had fought the previous war defensively, considering that their farmland had been captured and the area around the actual city of Athens was under the control of Spartans. So they were very defensive, considering that their livelihood depended on the capabilities of their navy and being able to bring in supplies. And so when Athens now sees that they're able to beat the Spartans, the Sicilians don't look like they really compare to the Spartans. And so it's sort of this bias they have against that really kind of urges them to kind of go get them. No problem.
Yeah, so St. Aquinas had this just war theory, and your entire paper was about war and what the Athenians did wrong. So, but just in general, if you were to look at the perspective of history, and maybe more specifically the US, is there ever a time when war is justifiable, not only for the government, but also for the people to willingly say, yeah, this is right?
Ooh, that is a tough question. A justified war. I mean, I guess if you brought up the topic of like the morality behind the sides, like again, if you compared, like the Nazis to the Americans in World War II, you could say that the Americans were in the right because they were liberating other countries. But that's more of, again, it's, and I hesitate to use World War II as an example because the majority of Germans that knew what was going on in the concentration camps was very small. So it's really just, I don't think really any war is justified, although there are good reasons to be going to fight. The example of the American Civil War, the idea of keeping the country together, that's a good example of a good reason of going to war and freeing the slaves, of course. But the actual fact of like going and killing other people is never really justified. I don't think there's in any way you could say that, oh yeah, I'm gonna go kill these guys over here because we're at war with them and I'm gonna feel better about it. I don't think there's really a way you could do that. But on a moral standing, comparing morals, you could say that yeah, we're in the moral right. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you very much, Mr. Thompson.